My fellow citizens of the world,
the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
YouTube, this is Winston Smith. Welcome to Episode 2 in the Combating Cult Mind Control series. Today we're going to talk about the influence continuum, also known as the BITE model, behavior, information, thought, and emotional control, outlined in Steve Hassan's book. And he elaborates on this by saying that there is this spectrum. On the left side are constructive and healthy organizations, and on the right side there are destructive and unhealthy organizations. And he says that an organization provides helpful or constructive influence if it has these essential traits. It routinely seeks the informed consent of its members. Checks and balances are built into its system of governance so that no one person or subgroup can seize control. It's transparent about its mission, finances, governance, and decision-making processes. And lastly, it encourages the growth, health, and sanity of its members. Leaders of organizations like this are honest, trustworthy, accountable, and transparent about what they do and decide, and also why. Their approach to leadership respects all group members' individuality, choice, and free will. They provide members and others with free and open access to information about the group. Ideally, they're also sincerely loving, compassionate, wise, or at least reasonably intelligent human beings. If we look at a typical organization on the opposite end of the spectrum, we find that it has these traits. No informed consent, information is manipulated and controlled. It has a top-down structure with one single leader at the top and a smaller inner circle immediately below. It's authoritarian, meaning that the orders are issued from the top and sometimes without any explanation or rationale, and those at the bottom must follow them without question. It has no guiding ethical principles. All goals justify the use of any means. And I think that is very similar to what we see in the news media. All goals justify the use of any means. That plays into the justification of violence that we see today on the left, with the James Hodgkinson, Hollywood actors advocating for violence when they give their acceptance speeches, saying that it's okay, we may have to punch people to start a revolution. All of that, it is now okay to use violence because Trump is in the White House. To continue, it has no guiding ethical principles. All goals justify the use of any means. It focuses on controlling, preserving, and acquiring power and information, but shares little of these with rank-and-file members, and none with outsiders. So again, when I was a witness, there was a secret elder book. Nobody knew about it except the elders. Again, hidden secret information that the rank and file do not know about. And there was also this thing they would call new light whenever a new teaching would come out, or if a traditional doctrine was changed. They would never explain why using logic. They would simply say, this is new light, and they would point to a scripture that uses that phrase and say this is Jehovah's direction that he's pointing us in. So again, it's a thought-terminating cliche. You're not supposed to question it. Oh, it's new light? Okay, got it. Let's implement it now. No logic whatsoever. It would make no sense, and if you started to question why it's changed, then you would get spoken to and brought to the back room, as they say. So, people at the top of these organizations do not lead through wisdom, consensus, compassion, or even brain power. They lead by making their followers frightened and dependent. They demand obedience and subservience. and they require their followers to dress, act, and think exactly alike. As we'll see in chapter 4 of this book, when we go into the episodes covering that chapter, one highly effective way to determine where an organization falls on this continuum is to apply what Hassan calls the BITE model: behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. And this model looks at each of those categories, and each are inherently neither good nor evil. If mind control techniques are used to empower an individual to have integrity and more choice, and the authority for his life remains with himself, the effects can be very beneficial. However, if mind control is used to change a person's belief system without informed consent and make him dependent on outside authority figures, then the effects can be devastating. The more a group seeks to control any or all of these aspects of its members' lives, the closer to the extreme end of the influence continuum it falls, and the more likely it is to be a cult. Another important model is that helps discern the core characteristics of a group is this pyramid diagram of a destructive cult. And when he evaluates a group and its use of the BITE model, it's important to use information that is descriptive of the pyramid format and not the circle outside the pyramid. He goes on to say, I refer to these people as fringe members. So fringe members are people who are kind of in, not fully dedicated rank and file members. At the top, there are obviously the leaders, one or a small group. Then there are sub-leaders. So the top would be the governing body in the Jehovah's Witness religion. Sub-leaders are probably elders, circuit overseers who travel around to different congregations. Then you have below that, take up probably about 40% of the pyramid, are the core devotees, which are, I would probably consider ministerial servants, the missionaries who put in 90 hours, 100 hours a month. I don't know what it's at now. They kept on raising it before. In order to be considered a missionary, it was like 60 hours a month, and they bumped it up to 90. Who knows what it's at now. And then lastly, there are the rank and file members, which take up the majority of the pyramid, probably another 45%. And then below that, which isn't really part of the pyramid, are the fringe members that Hassan talks about. They're not really in the cult per se, but they're kind of dipping their toes in, seeing what it's about. So a person who is affiliated very loosely in a behavioral sense may still be indoctrinated into the belief system through sleep deprivation, trance states, intensive workshops, spending time on discussion boards. If they're a witness, maybe going to one meeting a week instead of the 4 that they have. They're influenced and involved with the cult, but not to the extent of someone who works a full 80-hour work week if there's a staff, like on Scientology, things like that. So those people need to be evaluated as less extremely mind-controlled than the normal rank and file, but it still can be a destructive experience for them. Hassan says that sometimes he's asked to consult with a person and try to extract them just when they're getting involved with the group, before they've had time to experience the extremes of the cult. And he says by showing them the bigger picture and helping them to see the whole elephant, quote unquote, and not just the tail, it empowers them to reality test. Stepping back to visualize the entire entity is important. People are being incorrectly described as self-radicalized into becoming terrorists. These folks can be better understood as being on the fringe of a destructive cult, but within the sphere of influence of mind control. They are absolutely being recruited by people in person and online. The cult recruiters are experts at targeting their vulnerabilities and activating the motivations for that individual person. And political and religious cults can use terrorist tactics for aggressive recruiting, and some people are being sucked in right into their vortex. And before we move on to a more comprehensive description of mind control, there are a few points that we can cover, one of which being phobias. And this is a force that robs cult members' freedom. We all know someone who has had a phobia. Maybe you have one as well. And the most common phobias include fears of flying in planes, public speaking, taking elevators, driving in tunnels or over bridges. Kids often develop phobias about certain animals like snakes, spiders, even dogs. Basically, phobias are, the intense fear reaction to someone or something. A phobic reaction can range from very mild to severe. An intense reaction can cause physical responses like racing heartbeat, dry mouth, sweating, muscle tension. They can immobilize people and keep them from doing the things they truly want to do. And they can rob people of their own free choice. And often people develop phobias as a result of a traumatic life experience. For example, if a friend dies in a plane crash, an elevator, someone is traveling and gets stuck for hours and it's dark without the lights go out, if you're bitten by a snake, we learn to associate extremely negative feelings with that object. So after one of these experiences, our fears can then take on a life of their own, and within minutes, or sometimes it takes years, they can become full-blown phobias. The structure of a phobia involves several internal components that interact to cause a vicious cycle. These components include worrisome thoughts, negative internal images, feelings of dread, being out of control. Just thinking about the object or the animal can sometimes trigger the cycle into action. The person might say to himself, I hope the teacher doesn't call on me to give my report in front of the classroom. That thought alone is enough to cause them to start feeling tense and anxious. They see, usually unconsciously, a picture of themselves going to the front of the class and freezing up. In this vivid motion picture, if you will, they see themselves sweating, fidgeting, and their minds turning blank. Everyone's laughing at the teacher, or everyone's laughing at you while you're speaking, and the teacher starts yelling at them. This imagined ridicule causes them to feel even more upset and fearful that they will be called upon. Such a person could be well on their way toward having a fully developed phobia. People who were sexually abused as children often have crippling phobias about themselves, programmed into them by their perpetrators. Many children have no conscious memories of the phobia installation or upload, if you want to call it that, but they suffer deep trauma issues about identity and sexuality. They're unable to visualize themselves being healthy and valued as a unique human being. Not surprisingly, a large number of sex trafficking victims were sexually abused as children, making them especially vulnerable to recruitment and continued abuse. This childhood mind control abuse set them up for being abused again and again later in life. But what do phobias have to do with cult groups and mind control? Well, in some cults, members are systematically made to be phobic about ever leaving the group. Today's cults know how to effectively implant vivid negative images deep within members' unconscious minds, making it impossible for them to even conceive of ever being happy and successful outside the group. And that is absolutely true. When I was a witness anytime someone left, because when you're a teenager, there are people who slowly kind of fade away, or they start dating someone outside of the religion, and I remember the atmosphere and the vibe, and feeling this way myself as well, like, oh wow, they left, so they're not going to be living a happy life anymore. They're sad, and they will just be living a pathetic existence. I just really remember thinking that. It was never a good thing, obviously. It was never like, oh wow, she found someone and she got married and she's happy now, she has a kid. No, it was always like this dreadful thing just because they were outside of the religion. There's no possible way that anyone could fathom that they could be happy. So he goes on to say, when the unconscious is programmed to accept such negative associations, it behaves as though they were true. The unconscious mind of the typical cult member contains a substantial image bank of all the bad things that will occur if they or anyone were to ever betray the group. Members are programmed either overtly or subtly to believe that if they ever leave, they will die of some horrible disease, hit by a car, killed in a plane crash, or cause the death of loved ones. Some cult members, some cults program members to believe that if they leave the group, planetary nuclear holocaust will be the result. Jesus Christ. Yet, cult-induced phobias are so cleverly created and implanted that people often don't even know they exist. Yes, that is true. It blew my mind after I went to college and I started to cease going to meetings regularly, and I just had so much more time to do what I wanted to spend my time on, and it made me a happier person. And I remember thinking, like, wow, I can do anything. Like, with all this new free time, I can do anything I want, and direct my energy towards things that will make me happier. And I remember having that epiphany. I was in the hallway in my dorm in my sophomore year. It's a very vivid experience. It was like it just hit me all of a sudden. So yes, that is very true. And you don't even know that your state of mind is thinking that way previously until after you come to that realization. So of course, these thoughts are irrational and nonsensical, but keep in mind that most phobias are irrational. Most planes don't crash, most elevators don't get stuck, and most dogs are not rabid. Imagine what it would be like if you believed that mysterious people were determined to poison you. If this belief were implanted deep in your unconscious, do you think you'd ever be able to go to a restaurant and have a meal? How long would it be before you only ate food that you bought and prepared for yourself? If by chance someone you were eating with in a restaurant suddenly became ill, how long would it be before you stopped eating out altogether? Beliefs like this, whether conscious or unconscious, would substantially limit your choices. If the belief were not conscious, you might try to rationalize your behavior by telling your friends that you don't like eating out because you're on a diet, or because restaurants are unsanitary, or you're trying to save money. Either way, your choices no longer include simply going to a restaurant and enjoying a good meal. In the same way, cult phobias take people's choices. Members truly believe they will be destroyed if they leave the safety of the group. They think there's no way outside the group for them to grow, spiritually, intellectually, or emotionally. But once they become conscious of their desire to leave, it is usually only a matter of time before the authentic self develops a stronger and stronger voice. Why? Because mind control groups constantly change their doctrines and policies. Members, and again, that falls in line with the new light that the witnesses put out. And in 1984, if you're familiar with that, the totalitarian government constantly changes who are their allies and their enemies. One day on the news it will be Eurasia, and the next day it will be East Asia or the Pacific. I forget what they refer to it as, but each day when it changes, they would go back to historical records and change all of the names so that the enemies would then fall in line, and the past records would fall in line with who their enemies currently are. And we see that today. The narrative in the media is constantly changing, and some of the beliefs that the mainstream media outlets put out in their narrative contradict themselves. And we have that with the advent of the internet. Obviously, articles can be changed with the click of a button and just not called out as being updated. So this is why, taking screenshots is very important. The Wayback Machine is a tool that can be used to document the pages that exist on a website at specific dates in time. It keeps a record, an archive of all of those things. So these are tools that we can use to fight back when outlets, especially the New York Times, seems to do that very frequently. So it's once people become conscious of their desire to leave, again, their authentic self will develop over time, and members are constantly exiting. Leaders need to keep lying and change these policies to try to maintain control. And he puts a note in his book here. It says, working with extremist cult members and victims of human trafficking, it is essential to professionally evaluate threats of harm. They might not be all phobias. They may actually be legitimate. Unfortunately, for these cult survivors, threats of harm to themselves or loved ones are often real. Special steps must be taken to make sure they are safe. So that is if you are trying to extract from some occult. That is a very useful piece of information. It's very dangerous, depending on the level that someone is involved in. Especially if there's like a pimp and you're trying to get someone out of a sex trafficking ring, that's very intense and lives are at stake. And even when it's not something that obvious, where violence could break out, suicide rates among cult members, if you're trying to extract someone, that's a very intense experience. They're being torn in different directions. Suicide is also something to watch out for with the person you're trying to extract. So the next subsection here is labeled the unconscious mind, the key to creativity and vulnerability. What makes us all so vulnerable to these influence processes? The answer lies in the mind, the nature of mind itself. The human mind has been described as an extraordinarily sophisticated biocomputer that is oriented for learning patterns of survival. It's remarkable in its ability to creatively respond to a person's needs as well as to their environment. Our mind filters out floods of information every second so that we can cope with those things that we consider important. Our minds are huge reservoirs of information stored as images, sounds, feelings, tastes, and smells. All this information is systematically connected in meaningful ways. Our sense of self develops over years of life experience. As we grow and change, our beliefs about ourselves and the world change as well. Our beliefs serve as the major means of processing information and of determining our behavior. We have a certain degree of conscious control, but most matters are controlled unconsciously. The conscious mind has a narrow range of attention. The unconscious does all the rest, including regulating all body functions. Imagine having to tell your heart to beat 72 times every minute. You would never have time for anything else. The unconscious mind is the primary manager of information. It is our creative unconscious that allows us to make mental pictures and to experience them as real. Try this experiment. Take a moment and allow your mind to transport you to a tropical paradise. Feel the warmth of the sun, a cool breeze, and the smell of the ocean. Even if you have never been to such a place, it's still possible to perform this experiment. Did you go somewhere else for that moment? Our imagination can be channeled in other ways too. For example, professional basketball players visualize the ball leaving their fingers and going through the net before they shoot. These capacities to fantasize and visualize exist within everyone and are an essential component of being human. We all have dreamed about happier times in our lives, perhaps meeting the perfect person, winning the lottery, things like that. But hypnosis can also be used to create in our unconscious minds a fantasy world that can be used to enslave us. As we grow, the mind does not erase previous memories. It layers new experiences over them in a very systematic way. For example, try to remember playing with your favorite toy when you were a kid, or eating your favorite food. Our memories of childhood form a vast storehouse that can be tapped and exploited by hypnotic techniques. It is not accidental that many destructive cults tell their members to become like little children, mimicking Christianity. It says you must be as one of these to enter the kingdom of heaven. And witnesses say we should be sheep as well. And that falls in line. Adults can easily be age regressed to a time when they had little or no critical faculties. As children, we were helpless and dependent on our parents as the ultimate authority figures. The mind, despite all of its strength and stability, has weaknesses too. It's dependent on a stream of coherent information to function properly. Put a person in a sensory deprivation chamber, and within minutes, he will start to hallucinate and become incredibly suggestible. Likewise, put a person into a situation where his senses are overloaded with non-coherent information, and the mind will go numb as a protective mechanism. It gets confused and overwhelmed, and critical faculties no longer work properly. It is in this weakened state that people become very open to suggestion. The mind needs frames of reference in order to structure reality. Change the frame of reference, and the information coming in will be interpreted in a different way. Take, for example, the Jewish rite of circumcision. If you take away the cultural meaning and the medical advantages, it looks like an assault on a defenseless infant. Our belief system allows us to interpret information, make decisions, and act according to our beliefs. When people are subjected to a mind control process, most do not have any frame of reference for the experience, and consequently, they often accept the frame of reference given to them by the group. When we make decisions, we usually base them on information we believe to be true. We don't have time to verify every piece of information that comes at us. And that, again, is something that the mainstream media takes advantage of. They know that most of what they say, the people watching are not going to fact check them. When we shop, for example, we tend to believe it when we're told that a particular item is cheaper here than at any other store. After all, why would the salesperson lie, particularly if you can come back and complain? If we distrusted everything and everybody, we would be naive and taken advantage of. Or if we did trust everything and everybody, we would be naive and taken advantage of for the rest of our lives. Therefore, we strive to live our lives in a balance between skepticism and trust. A person with an open mind seeks to live within that healthy balance. Mind control techniques seek to upset that balance. Con artists are professional liars. Their greatest assets are their looks and their ability to charm. Many victims of con artists remark that they trusted the person because they didn't look like a criminal. The successful ones, like Bernie Madoff, for example, never do. They convey a humanness that bypasses a person's defenses. They're usually great talkers, but don't appear to be too slick. Slickness would give them away. Con artists size up their victim, make the con, get the money, and leave. Cult recruiters use many of these same skills. but they don't leave. They want you to join them. Almost all of them were victims themselves at one point. They believe that what they are doing is truly beneficial for you. However, they want something more valuable than your money. They want your mind. Of course, they'll take your money as well along the way, but they don't run away like common criminals. They want you to move in with them. Not only that, they want you to go out and do the same to others. Like it or not, everyone is vulnerable to mind control. Everyone wants to be happy. Everyone needs affection and attention. Everyone is looking for something better in life. More wisdom, knowledge, money, better status, more meaning, better relationships, better health. These basic human qualities and needs are exactly what cult recruiters prey upon. It's important to remember that, for the most part, people don't join cults. Cults recruit people. So let's discuss some basic recruitment approaches and how we can become more aware of and identify cult recruitment. The best way to instantly recognize the ways in which cults make their appeals for membership is through four basic ways. One, by a friend or relative who's already a member. Two, by a stranger, often a member of the opposite sex, who befriends them. Three, through a cult-sponsored event such as a lecture, symposium, or movie. Four, through social media such as Facebook, YouTube, Vimeo, Instagram, blogs, etc. Even Wikipedia is now being actively manipulated by wealthy cult groups. Google, Bing, and other search engines are routinely manipulated by some of the wealthier cults, which have small online armies that bury critical information or mount disinformation campaigns against critics. Usually an individual does not suspect he or she is being recruited. The friend or relative wants to share some incredible insights and experiences, or they say they just need your opinion in order to trick you into an indoctrination session. If the recruiter is a stranger, more often than not, you think you've made a good friend. Surveys of present and former cult members indicate that the majority of people recruited into destructive cults were approached at a vulnerable time of stress in their lives. And that, as a former witness, I can attest, anecdotally, of course, to that being true. A lot of the people in the specific congregation I was in had undergone a lot of adversity, serious life-threatening health issues, on the verge of death, literally. People who are being abused by their alcoholic husbands, people with schizophrenia. Really, most witnesses that I know and did know have very serious mental health problems due to a number of very intense situations they've been through in their lives. And I think the witnesses take advantage of that. You know, when you're at that weak point, here they come along offering you hope, paradise, earth, cure of all sickness, living in perfect health on a paradise after you die. It's very appealing to those kinds of people. And if you think about it, if you're a happy person, you love life, you're enjoying life, what more do you need? You're probably not going to join a cult because you are already content with what you have. So it makes sense. And cults just attract very disturbed people for this reason. And the stress is often due to some kind of major transition. For example, Hassan goes on to say moving to a new town, starting a new job, breaking off a relationship, financial instability, losing a loved one. People in these situations tend to have defense mechanisms that are overloaded or weakened. And if they don't know how to spot and avoid destructive cults, they're easy prey. And it's important to recognize that recruitment doesn't just happen. It's a process imposed on people by other people. High-powered business executives pressured by competition and driven by a need to succeed are recruited by colleagues who tell them about the incredible benefits to be obtained from taking a particular course. College students can be pressured by academic work and a need for acceptance to make friends with a professional cult recruiter or go to a group's presentation on some current social issue. A housewife, for example, driven by the need to do something with her life, follows the example of a friend and buys into a pyramid scheme. A high school student might be dared by peers into dabbling in satanic rituals. These are all just some examples. Other people can be initially brought into contact with a cult through an impersonal medium. Some people begin by buying a cult book advertised on TV as a bestseller. Others get emails as invitations to a Bible study session. The witnesses sit down and handwrite letters on the weekends for hours and mail them out. So when you receive it in the mail, it looks like it's a very personable letter from a friend. People might answer a want ad. Some are recruited when they take a job with a cult-owned business. And that's another thing in the religion. A lot of the elders, ministerial servants, own their own blue-collar businesses, painting, cleaning businesses, plumbing businesses, and they employ other witnesses. So this is yet another aspect of your life that is intertwined. You are now financially dependent on the cult. Because if you leave, you also will lose your job. And so they make it so that every aspect of your life is involved with them and relies on them. So whatever the approach, personal contact is eventually made with recruitment, and the recruiter starts to learn about the potential recruit, their hopes, their dreams, their fears, relationships, job, interests. The more information the recruiter can elicit, the greater the opportunity to manipulate that person. The recruiter then strategically plans how to bring the person into the group step by step. The plan might include effusive praise and flattery, introducing the person to another member with similar interests and backgrounds, sometimes deliberate deception about the group, or evasive maneuvering to avoid answering questions. Virtually anyone can be seduced into a mind control relationship or recruited into a cult, especially if they don't understand what to watch out for. In the 70s and 80s, the typical cult member was college-aged, but by the late 1980s, it had become commonplace for people of all ages to fall victim. Elderly people are quite likely to be recruited. The elderly tend to be solicited for heavy financial contributions or public relations endorsements. Middle-aged people are recruited for their professional expertise to help set up or run cult-owned businesses. Young people, for the most part, represent the core workers. They can sleep less, eat less, and work harder. And that is very true. If you think about the witnesses, a lot of people who donated, most of the time they would be the elderly people, because obviously they've had more time to save money. Those are the ones you usually see around the donation box. The people, middle-aged people in the religion, were the ones who owns the businesses, and so they would also run the field service arrangements and organize people, and direct them which neighborhoods to go in, and they would run the meetings before preaching door to door. And then the people who actually go door to door most often are the teenagers and the people in their young 20s and 30s who, I remember in the blistering heat, you're in a suit in 95-degree weather going door to door. Absolutely brutal. And only the younger people can do that. And that's what we did for hours on end. It was absolutely terrible. And he goes on to say, although the white middle class is still the main target of recruitment, several groups are now actively seeking out blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. As they gather individuals from these communities, they use them to design programs that will bring in others. The big cults have already developed indoctrination programs in Spanish. Yep, that's the witnesses have many languages they put out their propaganda in. Another target population is made up of Europeans visiting, going to school, or working in the U.S. After a few years of training and indoctrination, usually with expired visas that these visitors have, they're sent home to recruit in their own countries. Cults also reach into foreign countries to provide workers. For decades, Scientology has recruited in Africa, Eastern Europe, and Asia to provide staff for its US, UK, and Australian organizations. Recruits are offered a scholarship, which in reality is a 90-hour work week. Interestingly, cults generally avoid recruiting people who will burden them, such as those with physical disabilities or severe emotional problems. They want people who will stand up to the grueling demands of cult life. If someone is recruited who uses illegal drugs, they're usually told to either stop using them or to leave. To my knowledge, Hassan says, there are few people with disabilities recruited in cults, because it takes time, money, and effort to assist them. People born into cults who develop disabilities are often distanced and sent to government welfare programs. So, to go on, the next subheading, Cult Life, Illusion, and Abuse. Once a person joins a destructive cult, for the first few weeks or months, they typically enjoy a honeymoon phase. They're treated as though they were royalty. They're made to feel very special as they embark on a new life with the group. The new convert has yet to experience what life in the group is really going to be like. Even though most cult members say publicly that they're happier than they've ever been in their lives, the reality is sadly different. Life in a destructive cult is, for the most part, a life of sacrifice, pain, and fear. People involved full-time in a destructive cult know what it's like to live under totalitarianism, but can't objectively see what is happening to them. They live in a fantasy world created by the group. Some destructive groups essentially make addicts out of their members. With alcoholism and substance abuse treatment so much in the national spotlight today, it's important that mental health professionals pay attention to this former cult member population. People indoctrinated to perform excessive hours-long meditation or chanting techniques every day can become psychologically and physiologically addicted to the mind control technique. Such mind-stilling generates strong releases of brain chemicals, which cause not only a dissociated mental state, but also a high, a euphoria similar to that created by drugs and other addictions. Some former members who have used these techniques for several years report a wide variety of deleterious side effects, including severe headaches, involuntary muscle spasms, and diminution of cognitive faculties, like memory, concentration, and decision-making ability. Of course, some pimps get their victims hooked on heroin or meth or other drugs to control their minds, make them dependent, so there are serious health effects and long rehabilitation is needed. Very interesting. Cult members tend to spend all their time either recruiting more people, fundraising, or working on public relations projects. When people are fully hooked, they donate large amounts of their money and assets to the group, sometimes everything they own. In exchange, they're promised care and meaning for the rest of their lives. This transaction leaves the person dependent on the group for everything: food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare. This is very true. In the 1970s, this is obviously before I was born, but there was a mass exodus of the Jehovah's Witnesses. They predicted the Armageddon in, I think it was 75 or 78, and they told people to sell their homes and donate the profit to the organization so that they could help prepare for Armageddon. And that date came and went, and nothing happened, and a lot of people were pretty pissed off about it and decided not to go back. So there was a huge number that left the religion, and since then they've wised up and they don't set an actual date. When I was going, I left in like 07-ish, 08-ish. The phrase was, this Armageddon will become before this generation passes. So, in other words, very vague terms. Generation is what? A lifespan of a person. So, isn't that convenient that pretty much anyone listening to this will die, and before Armageddon comes. So, yeah, maybe the infants might survive, but they have no idea what the fuck's being said, so they're not going to remember. And then, it's just something a phrase they can continue using and never have to change it. So, in many groups, the care that is provided to members is less than adequate. Medical neglect is rampant. People are made to feel that any medical problem is the result of some personal or spiritual weakness. All they need to do is repent and work harder, and the problem will go away. Few cults carry health insurance for their devotees, so when a person becomes critically ill, they're often sent as an indigent to a hospital or a free clinic. People who work devotedly for years, sometimes making hundreds of thousands of dollars for the group, are told that the group can't afford to pay their medical bills. Often they are asked to leave the group until they have healed. A person who requires expensive treatment will often be asked to go back to their family so that the family will pay the bills. If the person doesn't have a family who will help, they may be driven to a hospital and abandoned. Some cults, like the followers of Christ, advocate faith healing as the sole treatment for medical problems. The outcome can be great suffering and even death. People are told that their illness has a spiritual cause and are made to feel guilty for not totally devoting themselves to the group. Some cults tell members that going to a doctor would show their faithlessness. A few will even threaten to excommunicate members if they seek medical attention. And this is where the blood issue comes in with witnesses. They previously refused all blood transfusions, and many people have died because they needed a transfusion and refused it on the grounds that they believed it was against biblical rules. And that is something the witnesses, they carry around a blood card. And it's in case they are unconscious and found in an unconscious state by a medical professional, that the hospital will then know not to perform a blood transfusion, even if their life is at risk. Now, they've since changed that, and I think it may be a decade ago, they started to accept blood fractions, which really is just blood itself for the most part. It's that's a whole nother video to go over the details of that. But regardless, the point is people will die because they refuse medical treatment if it involves blood. So another similar problem is child abuse. Many children have died or been scarred for life because of their parents' involvement in destructive cults. Many people have forgotten that nearly 300 children were murdered during the Jonestown Massacre. Wow, I did not realize it was that much. Those children had no choice but to drink the poisoned Kool-Aid. The public also doesn't know that many of these children were the wards of the state of California and had been adopted by People's Temple members to provide more income as well as serve as cheap labor. Some groups advocate beating and torturing children to enforce discipline. Witnesses do that. They advocate using the rod sparingly, they say. There's a scripture they point to. And so a lot of witness kids were beaten, spanked, hit with wooden spoons, belts, things of the like. And that was normal to me when I was growing up, and now when I tell people that, they're just completely shocked, and they're like, that is abuse. I do think it was more of an old school way of thinking for sure, and now it's more frowned upon than it was maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, when I, saw it happening and experienced it. But even then, I think it could be borderline abuse depending on the severity of it. But yes, this is absolutely something. In other words, the element of fear is always ingrained in your head from any type of authority figure. So he goes on to say, at Jonestown at night, some children were put into dark pits that they were told were filled with snakes. Members would dangle ropes from above to scare them. Although Jonestown was an extreme example, several groups do use rods and sticks to beat children, at times for hours and sometimes all over their bodies. Some groups subject children to sexual abuse as a matter of doctrine. Because children are often kept out of school and away from other contact with society, the abuse goes unreported. This just made me think of Tony Robbins. There's a documentary on Netflix about him, and there's a woman in one of his conferences that's like $10,000 to attend. There's a woman who he called out in the audience. She told her story. She was sexually abused by a leader of a cult because she was told that was how she is supposed to get close to Jesus. And now she is giving all of her money to Tony Robbins for these conferences and courses, and that is just another cult. And it's difficult to see that. So basically she's cult hopping, and that is something that is also a bit common that I've seen. When people leave one cult, they just go into another. So that is a very dangerous thing, and when you try to extract someone, you need to be wary of. But yeah, Tony Robbins is a complete joke. He's taking advantage of all of these cult practices in order to create a following and basically collect people's money. He's insanely rich because of it. And all the tactics, you can just analyze. Maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll have maybe we'll watch that Netflix. Hard Bastard and I could put that on and do that as the next Cult Watchers episode. I think that's a great idea. Because people don't see those things as cults. They're a little bit weird. People will say it's kind of strange, but very rarely do you hear someone actually attribute the terminology cult to those groups. So that's fantastic. I think we'll do that. Children, Hassan says, are often raised communally and allowed only infrequent visits with their real parents. The children are taught to place their allegiance with the cult leader or group as a whole, not with their parents. Playtime is limited or denied altogether. Children typically receive an inferior education, if any. And yes, witnesses do homeschool. Not everyone, but the more strict ones will homeschool their children to isolate them even further from any contact with the outside world. Like their parents, they're taught that the world is a hostile, evil place, and they're forced to depend on cult doctrine to understand reality. Although they may be regarded as the future of the group, they're also usually seen as a hindrance to the immediate demands of the cult's work. Terrorist cults are known to abduct children and turn them into killers and rapists. He mentions Harvey Schwartz's book about trauma inflicted on children recruited to become soldiers. The title is The Alchemy of Wolves and Sheep, a relational approach to internalized perpetration in complex trauma survivors. The casualties of mind control thus include millions of people, their children, and society as a whole. Our nation is being robbed of our greatest resource, bright, idealistic, ambitious people who are capable of making an enormous contribution to humankind. Many of the former cult members I know have become doctors, teachers, counselors, inventors, and artists. Imagine what so many cult members could accomplish if they were all set free to develop their unique talents and abilities. What if they channeled their energies into problem solving rather than trying to undermine the world's freedoms with some warped totalitarian vision? In the meanwhile, destructive cult groups continue to grow more numerous and powerful, operating with virtual free license to enslave people. It is ironic that in the United States, a country that cherishes freedom and liberty, citizens are better protected from sales pressure at a used car lot than they are from organizations whose intent is to hijack their minds and hearts. Until the law sets restrictions on such practices and recognizes the existence of modern mind control techniques, people are mostly left to protect themselves. Perhaps the single most important thing to realize in dealing with destructive cults is that we are all vulnerable. The most we can do to protect ourselves is inform ourselves thoroughly about the ways in which destructive cults operate and be good consumers when approaching any group we might be interested in joining. Friends or relatives of people seeking some kind of major group involvement or passing through times of unusual stress should remain alert to sudden personality changes in those people. If you do suspect that someone you know is coming under the influence of mind control, a person or an organization, it is important to act quickly and seek help. Most medical problems respond better to early detection and treatment, and the same principle holds true here. Be a good consumer about any group that interests you before you make any commitments. First and foremost, do careful research. One place to start is with freedomofmind.com. Other helpful sites are icsahome.com, factnet.org, and apologeticsindex.org. But don't assume that if a group isn't mentioned on any of these sites as potentially worrisome, that it's automatically okay. It's important to dig deeper. In Google or some other search engine, type the name of the organization with the entire name inside quotation marks and the word cult. Also try the name of the group and the word scam or scandal. Try variations with the name or the leader of the group in words like criminal, abuse, sex, things like that. And look at more than the first page or two of the results, because cults have learned and pay these search engines to bury the negative articles and blogs. In the 21st century that we live in today, when it comes to any group, it's important to do as much background research as you would before buying a TV, computer, or a car. That is all for today's episode of Combating Mind Control. Thanks for listening. This is Winston Smith.